Hello students, it's Professor Del Russo again, and the next thing I'd like to do is talk to you about question types. Before we get to video 5.3 and then later video 5.5, it's important that you appreciate and understand that there are different kinds of question types that we use in forensic interviewing. First of all, you will appreciate later when I share with you the hourglass metaphor that these question types they go from indirect or less suggestive to more suggestive and then really suggestive. So you start out very open-ended and then you get slightly more direct and then more direct and then really direct. And the reason we break them down this way is because we know science has told us that when questioning children, the more open-ended the question, the less information in the question, the more likely that you're going to get reliable information. And of course, the more suggestive the question, the more likely you're going to get information that's not so reliable. We need to go back and think about our learning module 4 when we talked about memory and suggestibility. And in that section, we differentiated two kinds of memories, recall memory and recognition memory. Let's take a look at those a little more closely and refresh our memory. You may recall that recall memory is that kind of memory, the type of memory that doesn't rely upon cues or prompts or something to jog the child's memory. It's very open-ended. It is a memory that is purely based upon the child's recollection. The adult has little role in creating or facilitating or influencing the narrative. Now, recognition memory, as the name implies, and as we talked about in Learning Module 4, has the root of recognition. When we tap into that kind of memory, we're using something that the child recognizes to jog their memory, to facilitate their recollection. And the smaller the child, the more likely they need some form of recognition questioning. You don't get a lot of information from children with free recall. Nevertheless, the starting point is always free recall. And you should not abandon free recall unless you're absolutely satisfied that you have exhausted it. So if you look at this slide, you'll see the comparison at the very bottom. Recall memory is more reliable. The problem is you get less information. The narrative is weak. Not in terms of reliability, but there isn't a lot of the story there. You're only getting a small snapshot of the story. Nevertheless, you need to start with recall memory. When you move on to recognition memory, well, then you're getting a little bit more suggestive. And you'll see that when we talk about that hourglass metaphor. The thing about recognition memory is, especially with smaller children, you get more information. It's less reliable. That is, the information that you get is not as likely to be the true, complete truth as it would be with recall memory, but you get more of it. Now, that doesn't mean that recognition memory results in falsehoods. Hardly. You just get information that is statistically less reliable. And that's never a good thing when you're doing a forensic interview. Nevertheless, it's nearly impossible to do a forensic interview without tapping into recognition memory. Children, especially small children, need their memory prompted. They need their recollection jogged a little bit. And we talked about that when we studied memory and suggestibility in Learning Module 4. And I shared with you the ways that someone could tap into recognition memory. The most common way is using a question. Well, tell me what happened in the shed. Well, you use the word shed, and that jogs the memory a little bit. Sure, it's suggestive. It tells the child, hey, maybe something happened in the shed. But it takes them to the shed, it jogs the memory, and hopefully the child, and in more cases than not, you're going to get some information about the shed you wouldn't have received if you simply said, tell me everything that happened. So a question can be a cue or a prompt that facilitates recognition memory. Taking the victim to the scene of the crime, we talked about that. That's a very tried and true way to tap into recognition memory. Sights, smells, places, things can tap into recognition memory. Showing a child a sneaker, for example, or a painting on the wall could conceivably tap into recognition memory. They recognize it, it has some nexus or some connection to their experience, and by seeing it, it jogs their memory. So that's recognition memory. And we need to be always mindful of that when we're doing a forensic interview. And the driving force behind the hourglass metaphor, which you'll see later in one of the additional videos that I post, is the understanding of the difference between recall memory and recognition memory. So let's take a look at that metaphor I've been speaking of, the hourglass metaphor. And it's designed to help you understand questioning sequence in a forensic interview. There's the hourglass, there's the metaphor, and you'll see where we start out in the hourglass metaphor. We start out with an open invitation, and it calls for a narrative response. What's an open invitation? Well, that's something that calls for recall memory, that reliable form of memory. The best kind of questioning pulls for recall memory. So that's where we want to start, wide open at the top of the hourglass. And the second form of questioning is called cued recall. And that kind of questioning taps into recognition memory. Although how much we cue the child, how much information we provide as a cue, depends upon the kind of question or where we are in the interview. We can use cued recall without being too suggestive, or we can use cued recall by asking a highly suggestive question. So we're going to take a look at examples in a moment of all of these kinds of questions, but I just want to go down the metaphor, right down the hourglass, from wide open questioning to more direct questioning. So the next kind of questioning is option posing or multiple choice questioning. And there's a whole video cast about whether that kind of questioning works. Clearly, option posing or multiple choice questioning is a form of cueing a child's memory, but it is far more direct than a simple cued question, primarily because we're offering potential answers to the child. And I'm going to share with you in a moment forced choice multiple choice questions and open multiple choice questions. And later on in videocast 5.5, I share with you Professor Lytle's research, where the preliminary findings are, even if you add an open-ended section to a multiple choice question, that it's not truly a forced choice question, it doesn't really help a whole lot. There's one circumstance where it does help, and certainly the jury's still out, but right now there's no science behind having an open-ended section at the end of the forced choice or multiple choice question, and that it results in more reliable information in all cases. So we'll take a close look at that in video 5.5, where I dissect Professor Lytle's research. As you can see on the hourglass, the next section is called option posing, and that simply means multiple choice questions. And that's followed by yes or no questions, which is followed by suggestive questions. And we'll take a close look at examples of those kinds of questions in a moment. So here are examples of the hourglass metaphor question types. You have your open invitation, which we just discussed a moment ago. These are examples of question types. What do the questions look like? What do we say when we want to ask an open invitation question? Well, you've heard these before. They're wide open. They really don't provide any information at all. Tell me about that. Tell me more. Tell me what happened. Tell me all about that. Those are examples of open invitation. We don't provide the child with any information. We simply ask the child to tell us what happened. That is the best kind of questions. That's the kinds of questions there ought to be plenty of in a forensic interview. The more suggestive questioning, there ought to be very few of those. Now, they're going to be there because that's the way human interactions work, and they're going to be there because especially the smaller children need those kind of prompts to just get at their past experiences. But they ought to be the exception rather than the rule. And you always start from the top of that hourglass and work your way down. And when you ask a direct question, you go back to the top, and then you ask an open-ended question. What are some examples of cued questions? Cued recall. Tell me about the truck. You see, I'm putting a word in there, I'm putting some information in there, It's somewhat suggestive, mildly suggestive. It doesn't tell the answer. It just suggests that something may have happened in a truck. So that's cued recall. We're cueing the child with the word truck. Here are some other examples. What happened in the locker room? The cue there is locker room. You told me that he massaged you. On what part of your body did he massage you? Again, that's a cued recall question. It should say you told me, not he told me. That's an error in the slide. Option posing. Those are the multiple choice questions I just shared with you. Option posing examples are forced choice examples. Did he keep the condoms in a drawer, in the closet, or in his suitcase? You can see why we would call that a forced choice question, because we're providing the answers for the child, much like a multiple choice question on an exam. We're giving the child the answers, and little kids may assume that the answer is among those responses, even if it's not. They pay great deference to the grown-up, especially the smaller children. They may say, well, I kind of know the true answer, but maybe I don't really know. The grown-up would know. It's probably among those answers. Now, I'm not saying they go through this conscious kind of process, but that could happen unconsciously and subconsciously. They may assume the answer is among them, or they may pick the answer that's closest to the correct response. That's a forced choice question, not a good question to ask. The thought was that if we open up the forced choice question and we provide an open ending to the question, that might make the information that we get more reliable. And in Videocast 5.5, you'll see how the early research tells us that doesn't even really help. It feels like it should help, but it doesn't really help. Nevertheless, there's one scenario where it kind of helps. It increases the reliability somewhat. But we'll look at that in video 5.5. Let's take a look at a question that has an open end that's among the option posing type. Open-ended example. Did he keep the condoms in a drawer, in the closet, in his suitcase, or someplace else? The thought is at least it gives the child an open end, because if it's not among the selections that we offer, the child could reject those and then provide their own response. So that's a option posing type question. Lastly, and you could see I flipped them around from the hourglass metaphor image, are suggestive questions and yes/no questions. Both question types are suggestive, and they can be highly suggestive. And at times, if our information is wrong, they can be misleading. And that's worse than a leading question. And we don't know what happened. We weren't there. So any question that we offer that has information where we're just speculating about that information can be misleading. We want the information to come from the child. So an example of a suggestive question is, did you feel something yucky on your body? You can see why that's suggestive. It doesn't give the exact answer, and if you do ask a question like that, it's not the end of the world, but then you need to follow it up with what? An open-ended question. If the child says, yes, tell me all about that. Tell me all about what you felt on your body. Tell me more about that. And maybe the child describes with more detail something that we can conclude is important to the case. And in this case, perhaps it was seminal fluid or ejaculant or something like that in the world of child sexual abuse. And then there's yes/no questions, which can be the most leading, the most suggestive, and the most problematic of all. And those kinds of questions need to be avoided. Nevertheless, let me give you an example. Did he use a condom? Yes or no. It simply pulls for a yes or no answer. It offers a possibility there. It's suggestive, it's leading. And obviously with older people, it's not so much of a problem. But the younger the child, the more vulnerable they are to suggestion. So let's take a look at the last slide now. And I only give you this slide to show you that there's research on this. We will tease apart some of that research, not completely, but we will look at Professor Nicole Lytle's research in video 5.5, but I just want to share it with you. You may want to look it up in the Sprague Library at Montclair State University. There's copies on the databases there. Does it help, hurt, or something else? The effect of a something else response alternative on children's performance on forced choice questions. So that's just what we were talking about a moment ago. And there's some preliminary research on this. It's been published, it's been peer reviewed, And in video 5.5, we'll take a closer look at Professor Lytle's research along with Kamala London and Ashley Hall from 2017. So this sets the table now for the video casts that you're about to see. You're about to see videocast 5.3. And in that videocast, we talk about children where we're trying to break the ice with open-ended questions and they're not responding. They're not opening up. They're not giving us a narrative. We're not eliciting a narrative. And in video 5.3, Professor Poole and I, through the videocast, give you some suggestions about how to break the ice by being more direct, by being a bit more suggestive. And when you do that, of course, you need to follow up with an open-ended question. So once in a while, the child doesn't open up when we're trying to elicit a free narrative. We're trying to break the ice after the ground rules or after narrative practice, and we have to be more direct. So in an effort to open them up, in an effort to break the ice, sometimes we have to go down that hourglass and ask more direct questions. And that's why I wanted you to listen to this and look at this PowerPoint to see the kinds of questions there are, because this sets the table for video 5.3. And it also sets the table for video 5.5, of course, when we look at Professor Lytle's very interesting research from 2017.